Now, you've been involved in a project that catalogs open source related projects and projects made by U.S. government entities. How did that project come about?
This is that spreadsheet.
The timeline.
That was actually an initiative of Scott Goodwin at NASA, who he basically wanted evidence, by which I might mean ammunition, for making internal arguments about open source.
Sure.
And he said, well, look, I think the U.S. government has been releasing a lot of open source. No matter what the policies have said at any given time, I think we've actually been doing it in practice. Let's go find out. And so he surveyed all the usual suspects and then some, and opened up this spreadsheet and was really liberal about granting access. I mean, he figured what spammer is going to come and write stuff in this spreadsheet.
That's true.
And the result was this treasure trove of information dating back into the 80s, of stuff that has been released under what were then called free software terms and are now called free software or open source. I'm using the terms synonymously since they are synonymous. Of stuff released by federal government agencies, also some state and local, but the spreadsheet mainly covers federal. So it's just a ton of stuff.
And what are some of the uses of that data beyond just the spreadsheet, beyond just making the argument? I mean, does that give you a different view of how open source is in government? It
does. And the interesting next step, which I don't think Scott anticipated, was that Gunnar Hellickson of Red Hat, who I'm presenting with tomorrow on this topic, took that spreadsheet and then started compiling a separate history of non-code release events that were significant open source events. So like someone in a government agency writes an article, or someone signs off on a policy or something like that. And when you coordinate those with the code releases, you start to see, put them all in the same timeline, you start to see patterns.
Oh, no kidding.
One of the interesting ones is that agencies have different levels of, say, how conservative they are about what they do before there's a policy about it. So at the same time as we see this whole wave of articles coming out in the early 2000s about how open source is dispelling various myths. This stuff is secure after all. Actually, it is commercial off-the-shelf software, which is COTS is a very important acronym in government procurement. And these articles were arguing that it is. And there were studies done by Terry Bollinger, a famous one for the DoD. Meanwhile, while all this writing and arguing is going on, the Department of Energy has been releasing code all along. There was no policy about it, as far as I know, unless we missed it. It's possible we just missed it. But meanwhile, DoD is going through this carefully thought out process. On the other hand, the result of that is that in the DoD, there's now a very clear understanding all over the place that open source software is to be considered in procurement. It is okay to release it unless there's some security reason not to. And it's also officially considered commercial off-the-shelf software, which is confusing at first because many people say commercial, but I thought open source is free, like you can download for free. But commercial off-the-shelf doesn't mean proprietary off-the-shelf. It just means it's available to everyone. Right. You can get it in the open market, and the government wants that stuff.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Now, kind of broadening this a little bit, do you feel that government use of open source differs considerably from private use, or is there a lot of overlap there?
The use is similar in the sense that governments have similar needs to other organizations. I mean, you could view them as large nonprofit corporations that have special powers, or however you want, but they have technology needs. They're not so different from other groups' technology needs. What's different is the way that the government engages with open source projects. Government is just a lot less flexible than any private sector organization, let alone an individual, can be. It's like the opposite of a startup, right? I mean, for the government to engage with an open source project, there essentially has to be a chain of paperwork and decisions saying, oh yes, the employees can spend time on this, their code can go out, we can sign the contributor license agreement if there is one. And also, like in open source projects, things tend to turn on a dime in very flexible ways. I mean, there's a mailing list thread, and then all of a sudden, we've all agreed that this feature that we were planning is no longer the new hotness, and we're going to do something else instead. And that's a community consensus. But if that doesn't match what the government signed with a particular contractor who's actually doing the work, then that contract has to be renegotiated now, right? For them. Now, you can try to write your contracts to anticipate for that stuff, but that means now we're talking about changing various bits of procurement culture that are there for good reasons. I mean, the reason those contracts are so inflexible is because people tried to get away with murder in the past, right? I hope that's only a figure of speech, but
no,
you know
right,
what I mean.
Yeah, no, I know exactly. So
Yeah.
it's kind of anti-agile.
It's anti-agile for good reasons, but that makes it hard for the government to interface with open source projects in ways that are unique to government.
Okay.
Not that it can't, it's just that adjustment on both sides has to happen.
And so does that mean that, if government is starting to interface with open source projects, that open source projects in turn are interfacing with the government, should the expectation going in that this is a completely different perspective, that there's going to be frustrations and that you need to be ready for those? Or are we evolving towards a mode where both are coming together and it's working a little better?
I'm going to call out the passive voice there. Whose expectation, right?
Yeah.
The answer, I think, is yes, on both sides, but in different ways. So for the open source project, it's fair for them to treat government contributors or contractors who are being contracted by the government to do something in the project the same way they would treat any other participant. You don't have to make special exceptions or special procedures for them. But you should expect that maybe a request for information or a request to redo a patch or something, maybe there will be requirements placed on how they can do it that are unexpected, or there will be a time delay due to a need for a renegotiation or something in some cases. On the government side, I think there probably will have to be more expectation management, especially because government is a place of long careers, right? You'll have somebody in IT who's been doing IT management for 30 years, and they've learned a lot of important things about how to move government levers to get things done. But in the meantime, web development has the web has been invented, right? And web development has totally changed just in the last 5 years. And for that person to be managing employees, first of all, where are they going to be recruiting from? Who's going to want to work for the government when Facebook and Yahoo are hiring, right?
Right.
So, assuming you get people who are familiar with GitHub even, or the latest JavaScript libraries and things, you have to be competent to manage them in an open source project. So, and this is one reason the government contracts out a lot of stuff, but those contractors themselves have cultures that are built up over a long period, and they have, in some cases, become a little sclerotic by working with government. Let's be frank about it. So, there has to be expectation management, and if the open source project, if it is aware of this participation and can do some of that for them, can help them along that path, that's very useful.
Right.
And there are consultants like my firm and others out there that do this on both sides.
Sure. So looping back for the last question, back to the spreadsheet and the data that we were talking about, the timeline data, was there anything in there that surprised you? I mean, things like open source being adopted earlier than maybe you anticipated, or other things?
Well, actually, the biggest surprise, and again, we can't make claims for the rigor of this data. We did do a pretty broad survey. We got input from a lot of people, and there are definite patterns showing up. But what we saw was an early burst of open source interest, a lot of it funded by the Army, it's the Army Research Group or something, Army Research Labs, I can't remember, and DARPA. I may have some acronyms wrong here. Right, and that led directly to like the Computer Science Research Group at Berkeley and the Berkeley TCP/IP stack.
Right.
There was a bunch of stuff, and then there's this, and some NASA stuff, and then there's this like long fallow period in the late 80s, early 90s especially, before government starts getting visibly active in open source again. And what we see first is a slew of articles saying, oh no, open source is really okay, as though what had happened 10 years earlier had never happened, right? And then you see some policy debates, and policies come out saying, yes, we can do this, and meanwhile you see DOE starting to actually release code, and all this stuff is happening. So what is that fallow period? Well, there are a couple of explanations. One that we just learned recently, and I don't have the primary source on yet, is that the rules actually changed. There was a law passed saying that government code isn't necessarily in the public domain when run through a contractor the way it had used to be, or something. I'm paraphrasing an email that I just read recently, But there might have actually been a regulatory or even a legislative change that caused open source to sort of not be a viable way for things to go for a period of time. And then all this policy, these internal champions of it had to fight back. So I expected there to be a slow, gradual ramp. What I didn't expect was this initial burst of activity, then this long black hole, where nothing's happening, really. I'm sure there were a few things, but we haven't found them. And then there's this slew of articles and championing that is really visible. You can see the publications and the policies, and a lot of code suddenly getting released until today, when we have things like the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has this glorious open source policy that says basically everything we do will be open source as much as possible, not just using but also releasing.
Right.
That's which is really a capstone on the work of many people in the government over many years.
Interesting. Well, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate
thanks for the
taking
questions.
the time.
Yeah.